If you are looking only at U.S.-born Hispanics, their average education levels tend to be lower than non-Hispanic whites. So one of the questions that often comes up is we look at these earnings gaps or we look at differences in poverty. Hispanics tend to be more likely to be impoverished, have lower labor market earnings. Education does explain a lot of that, but it's not the only driver. And again, immigration is related to education. Immigrants, on average, tend to have less education than natives. But again, if we only look at natives, we still see at education gaps. So there's something happening within the Hispanic population where they're not acquiring as much schooling. And that's a concern as well, because these are individuals born here, they're American citizens, they're going through our schooling system, and yet we have a large number of them who are not going on to complete higher education. Why that should be a concern to the U.S. in general is because we have this growing population. And so if you have a growing population that is not acquiring education as rapidly as other groups, then that has implications for the future economic prosperity of this country. My name is Mora. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and I'm also the director of the American Economic Association's mentoring program. I have been studying Puerto Rico and the economic crisis for the past 5 years. A lot of the work I've done was before Hurricane Maria struck, but I have a book that came out in November 2017, and that book has been analyzing the economic crisis that Puerto Rico has been undergoing since the year 2006. When Hurricane Maria struck, a lot of media attention started looking at migrants from the island to the mainland and the deteriorated infrastructure, the loss of electricity, et cetera. But a lot of people are unaware that there was a lot of massive net outmigration really since 2006. And it had to do with this economic crisis that Puerto Rico has been enduring. Some people have referred to this crisis as being Puerto Rico's depression. In my book, and it's co-authored with Avidan Rodriguez, who is a sociologist, but also the president at the University of Albany, SUNY, and then my co-author, Alberto Davila, who is now the dean at Southeast Missouri State University. We've been actually looking at the issue of Puerto Ricans, again, for 5 years. It was going to be a book chapter, but the more we dug into the data, the more we realized there was something really big happening on the island that nobody was talking about. And we uncovered this economic crisis that was leading to this massive net outmigration. Poverty rates have been high and sustained for many years. So one of the things that we wanted to focus on is, in our book, we go through a lot of the impacts on the island population as well as what was happening with the migrants as they settled on the mainland. And then we have a lot of comparisons with mainland-born Puerto Ricans as well. In terms of the economic crisis, we referred to it as La Crisis Boricua. And the reason for that is we just kept talking about the crisis, but it just seemed like it was such a severe thing that we wanted to have something a little bit more formal to describe it. Since 2006, Puerto Rico's only had 1 year of positive economic growth, and that was back in 2012. So when Hurricane Maria struck, the island was already extremely weak, had a very weak labor market, had a crippling shutdown of industries, scaling back, a loss of jobs, and again, a loss of population. Puerto Rico's population has fallen, the latest reports for the U.S. Census Bureau has fallen to 3.2 million. But if you go back to 2006, the island had actually a population of 3.8 million people. So it's a severe outmigration, and one of the implications of that is that the population that's moving tends to be young. They're more likely to be in their childbearing years. So the population on the island is rapidly aging. They're not having children. And then the past 2 years, the natural increase, which is the difference between births and deaths, has also been negative. So all of this is actually before Hurricane Maria struck. The hurricane on the island hit the island at one of the worst times that it could have. The government's hands are currently tied in terms of rebuilding opportunities, the island government, I should say. That was part of the provision of the PROMESA legislation that was passed in 2016. So the budgetary implications for Puerto Rico have to be approved by an oversight board. Some of the criticisms of the oversight board is that it's not accountable to the Puerto Rican people, and they're looking at ways for Puerto Rico to manage its debt. So the government did declare bankruptcy back in 2015, I believe it was, and that led to this legislation. So essentially it's been a domino effect that we've seen unfolding since 2006. So one of the things that we found when we started looking at the data is that you can look at the average Puerto Rican migrant. So we use a lot of Census Bureau data, American Community Survey, and then there's a Puerto Rican Community Survey as well. And so if you just look at the typical migrant, you get one profile. But when we started looking at the profiles of Puerto Ricans, depending on where they were moving to the mainland, we were actually getting different characteristics. So those who are moving to places like Florida, and I should mention that between 2006 and 2016, Florida received 1/3 of all the migrants on net from the island, and the state is also receiving a positive number of net interstate migrants who are moving to the state. So we talk about Florida as being like it's the old new destination area of migrants. it became popular starting in the 70s and 80s. All the estimates I've seen of post-Maria migrants, Florida has only picked up in terms of its prominence. So the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College released estimates that almost half of the migrants since Hurricane Maria have been settling in Florida, to the point that actually Florida now has a larger estimated Puerto Rican population than even New York. So it tells you in terms of the massive scale of migration, and again, migration from the island, but also interstate migration. So a lot of the characteristics of what you would say like the typical Puerto Rican migrant, you can pick up with looking at migrants moving to Florida. They're kind of in the middle in terms of comparing that group with Puerto Ricans, for example, who moved to Texas. So it turns out Texas is also a big new receiving area of Puerto Ricans. You have a lot of these Puerto Rican communities in areas where there were very few even just 10 years ago. Those moving to Texas tend to be highly educated, high rates of employment. So the issues that they may be facing are different from those who are moving to the more traditional areas such as New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Migrants moving to those areas tend to be more likely to be impoverished, less likely to be employed, have lower levels of education. So in terms of thinking about what the needs of the incoming migrants would be, particularly now since the hurricane struck, we would want to consider like specifically where they're moving to. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all policy that could help these migrants adapt to their new homes. If you look at the Puerto Rican population, both on the island and mainland, and you look at the percentage of those who are living on the island, that's declined dramatically. And then if you look at those in New York, it's a slight decline over the past several years, but the Florida percentage has increased dramatically. And so if you look at the Hispanic population in the state, Cubans are still the largest Hispanic group, but if you take out Miami, Puerto Ricans are the largest in Florida. We've noticed that a lot of agencies, including state agencies, like, for example, in education, are recruiting teachers, for example, from Puerto Rico because of the growing Hispanic population in Texas. They're looking for bilingual teachers. The same we've seen with respect to recruiting for doctors, nurses, et cetera. So these agencies within the state are actively recruiting Puerto Ricans from the island. And again, this was happening before the hurricane. Once you have then the steady stream of migrants who are setting up new communities, then that is likely to lead to more migration into those communities. One of the things that we found interesting, though, is if you look at average earnings, they tend to earn more, as you would expect in Texas, because they're highly educated. But then when we were controlling for factors such as education to compare similarly educated workers in Texas who were not Puerto Rican with those who were, we found that they were not being rewarded as much for their skills. And so that warrants more investigation in terms of, it could be related to discrimination, that they may be heavily recruited from the island, but they're being underpaid for the work that they're doing. I'm an economist by training, but I'm specifically a labor economist, and my area of specialty for almost 25 years now in higher education has been focusing on Hispanic economic outcomes. And so I'm very interested in looking at not just Hispanics per se, but also differences within the Hispanic population. A lot of times, many of the reports we hear about Hispanics, there's this assumption like there's this homogeneous group out there that these numbers are picking up, but it's not the case at all. A lot of the average numbers that we hear are reflecting what's happening within Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans represent nearly 2/3 of all Hispanics in the U.S., excluding island residents. A lot of the characteristics of Mexican Americans are driving the trends that we see with respect to Hispanics overall. But we have to consider there are other Hispanic groups. For example, Puerto Ricans on the mainland represent about 1 out of every 10 Hispanics, and then Cubans would be the third largest group, followed very closely by Salvadorans. And so depending on where you are in the country, Puerto Ricans may be the largest group, particularly in the East Coast. Again, even in New York, they still are the largest Hispanic population. And so we lose a lot of that heterogeneity when we just talk about Hispanic average characteristics. And that gets into issues related to immigration status. Again, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens by birthright. So whether they're living on the island or mainland, they're Americans, so they're not immigrants. So when we are considering what's happening within the Mexican American population, there we're comparing very different groups. You have recently arrived immigrants from Mexico compared to people who have been in the country, what is now the U.S., longer before it was actually the United States. And so there are differences with respect to the needs and the outcomes of these groups. So somebody who's a recently arrived immigrant might have more of concerns with like finding employment or perhaps acquiring the English language. The average migrant from Mexico tends to be less educated than those who are born in the U.S. And so the outcomes associated with that group will be different than if we're comparing a third-plus generation Mexican American. The last thing we would want to see is to have a growing population that is falling further and further behind. And again, the issues related to Cubans. We have a lot of the refugees from the island of Cuba. So their needs and issues will be different than we're comparing, again, like Mexican Americans or Puerto Ricans. I think one of the problems with our profession is that we become somewhat slaves to our theoretical models, and to the point that sometimes it's like the model is driving what we're trying to research rather than having ideas and trying to find a model to explain what's happening. So one of the things I get very concerned about is that we have all these great tools in economics, but we're not necessarily using them to address economic and social problems. And I do have colleagues that they're just so into the technique, but not so much into the question, or try to address like, okay, we haven't answered the question, but let's push it further. Why? So like going into the research that I've done on Hispanic populations, we could look at, again, earnings differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites. There's an earnings difference. Education explains a lot of it. Okay, well, it explains a lot of it, but then that leads to another question about why. So why do we have these education differences? And what can we do as economists to raise awareness and to try to find ways to resolve these issues? Education explains a lot, and so if there are structural barriers that are preventing people from accessing, let's say, financial capital, means to go to school, transportation issues, that is blocking consistently a group of, again, American citizens from acquiring higher education, then that's where we can use our economic thinking to try to find solutions to that. Rather than just saying, well, I've answered the question, the difference is in education. But then we need to ask, well, why is it that we have differences in education, even among U.S. natives?